Let's start again. So we'll be having a look at implementation challenge for a particular kind of narrow scope and revisionary conceptual engineering, namely natural language engineering. Where what we're trying to do is we're trying to give new senses to familiar words for a variety of political or research purposes. Examples would include Sally Haslanger's introduction of a new definition of woman, David Chalmers' introduction of a new sense of the word zombie, the introduction of phenomenal senses for appearance and perception verbs by several philosophers of perception. Or indeed, a societally relevant example would be the promotion of the homosexuality sense of gay by the LGBT movement in the 1960s and 70s. In all these cases, a word that has a dominant sense in ordinary discourse is given a new sense, which then complements and in some cases even displaces the ordinary or established sense. The implementation challenge for this kind of conceptual engineering revolves around the question of whether we can give established words new meanings as we please, or what factors might constrain our ability to do so. This question was first raised by a young girl who ventured through a looking glass and there met a rather confident conceptual engineer with whom she had the following exchange. "When I use a word," Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, "it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." "The question is," said Alice, "whether you can make words mean so many different things." "The question is," said Humpty Dumpty, "which is to be master, that's all." Well, natural language reengineering typically seeks to endow familiar words with new but related senses. The ability to do so involves more than being able to explain these new senses. It also requires mastery of the new sense, that is, the ability to use the word in accordance with this normative explanation, in the contexts where this explanation applies. As it arises for natural language reengineering, Alice's question thus is whether or to what extent we can master the new senses of words with distinct but related senses, that is, new senses of polysemes words. And to what extent we manage to use polysemes words in accordance with the normative explanations, say definitions that are being laid down for them. So, to what extent are people able to use, interpret, and reason with polysemes words in accordance with the conceptual engineer's explanation of the new sense? You might think that all that's required is that the explanation be clear and rigorous and explicit, but, well, is that enough? So I'll now contribute to an empirical answer to Alice's question. In 4 steps, I'll first just briefly remind you of some potentially helpful notions from psycholinguistics. I'll then distinguish 2 processing strategies for polysemes words, the integration strategy and the retention suppression strategy. I'll then present some experimental work that has examined how word processing biases limit our mastery of new senses that are processed with the retention suppression strategy. I'll be basically drawing on a body of experimental work that started 7 years ago that I did mainly together with psycholinguist Paul Engelhardt, which was framed as a contribution to evidential experimental philosophy, but which in fact speaks directly to Alice's question as it arises for natural language reengineering. Our findings will finally motivate some rules of thumb that can help conceptual engineers maximize their chances of success in efforts to create new linguistic beasts that we can ride without getting thrown off. As commonly understood in cognitive science, a concept is a body of information stored in long-term memory and retrieved by default in the exercise of a series of higher cognitive competencies, including language comprehension, verbal reasoning, perceptual categorization, and inductive learning. That information is retrieved by default means it's rapidly retrieved by an automatic process, e.g. whenever we encounter a verbal stimulus, and that this happens either in every context, say in any old text that you encounter the word in, or outside all context, as in single word priming experiments. So on this application, the difference between conceptual knowledge and non-conceptual background knowledge is made purely in processing terms. What distinguishes conceptual knowledge from background knowledge is simply that it is retrieved by default. A lot of conceptual knowledge is represented by stereotypes. These are implicit knowledge structures that are built up through observation of co-occurrences in the physical environments or in the discourse environment, and through extraction of co-occurrence information from linguistic discourse. Stereotypes encode statistical information about typical and diagnostic properties of category members, so that the notorious tomato is red and round and juicy. Rather more complex stereotypes, known as situation schemas, encode information about typical features of events or actions, of agents performing them, patients being acted on, and of typical relations between them. Dependency networks in complex schemas encode causal, functional, and nomological information. So stereotypes really encode pretty rich bodies of information about the world knowledge. Many stereotypes are associated with individual words. In single word priming experiments, nouns and verbs rapidly activate associate stereotypes within 250 milliseconds. By the lights of this process distinction that we've just made, these kinds of stereotypes would qualify as encoding conceptual information. However, nouns and verbs together, say the mechanic checked, can swiftly activate complex schemas that encode information about recurrent situations, say car inspections, that is not activated by either the noun, mechanic, or the verb, checked, on their own. So these complex stereotypes about more specific situations qualify as further world knowledge. In sentence comprehension, both conceptual and further world knowledge get rapidly activated at the earliest possible moment. Activated knowledge becomes available for integration into the situation model when we, e.g., read or listen to what other people have to say. That is, it gets activated into the representation of the situation that's being talked about, that we construct as we listen or read, and that is then the basis for our own judgment and reasoning about the situation described. The construction of these models is guided by the heuristic principle that utterance interpretations should be positive, stereotypical, and specific. In line with this heuristic, speakers typically skip mention of stereotypical features, but make deviations from stereotypes explicit, as in the green tomato or the male secretary. In the absence of such explicit indications to the contrary, hearers assume that the situation talked about conforms to the relevant stereotypes and treat the most specific stereotypes activated as the most relevant. In this process, conceptual knowledge activated by individual words gets quickly complemented by further world knowledge that gets activated only by combinations of words. Both of these support stereotypical inferences that are defeasible. Natural language reengineering seeks to endow familiar words with new senses. I'll now consider two strategies for interpreting utterances that use such polysemous words, and we'll discuss empirical constraints on their interpretation. In contrast with homonyms like bank, polysemous words activate a unified representation or unitary representation, rather than anything describable as representations of different senses. This unitary representation is typically built around stereotypical features associated with the word. It's typically built around the stereotype associated with the most frequently encountered sense, or a sense that's privileged, e.g., through embodiment. Whenever we encounter the word in any sense, it activates this dominant stereotype, which is then deployed to interpret utterances that use the word in a less frequent sense. This can happen in at least two different ways, depending upon whether that stereotype underspecifies or overspecifies the relevant information, and accordingly is either completely relevant or only partially relevant in the utterance context. In these two different cases, two different strategies are used to interpret the utterance. We noted a moment ago that combinations of words swiftly activate non-conceptual background knowledge that is consistent with the stereotype, but does not get activated by each individual word on its own. This further information is used to disambiguate polysemous words. Where all conceptual information activated by the word alone is contextually relevant, disambiguation is a matter of adding further knowledge. So as an example, consider the interpretation of the polysemous word to see in a context where it's used in the sense to meet or visit, as in yesterday I've seen the doctor. So in this case, the verb on its own activates a generalized situation schema that we'll look at in a moment. But in addition to the schema that's associated with the verb, it also activates, together with doctor, a more comprehensive and extensive knowledge schema that organizes our information about doctor visits, a script about doctor visits. This information is compatible with that from the seeing schema because I visually see the doctor during my visit. Therefore, both schemas remain activated and inferences from both are integrated into the situation model for the utterance, I saw the doctor yesterday. By contrast, where only some of the stereotype associated with the dominant sense is relevant, the stereotype needs to be, as it were, cut down to fit the occasion, and the contextually irrelevant components need to be suppressed. As an example, consider the interpretation of the purely epistemic use of see in Jack sees the risk. Now, here, the verb initially activates the situation schema that's associated with the dominant visual sense. This schema comprises agent features, including S looks at X, S knows X is there, S knows what X is. It includes its patient features like X is in front of S and X is near S. Now, we suppress all the contextually irrelevant features, all the contextually irrelevant components of this complex stereotype. So the agent feature as looks as X is irrelevant. The patient features X is in front of S is irrelevant. The feature X is near S is irrelevant. But we retain the two features, the two agent features that are contextually relevant, namely the epistemic agent features as knows X is there and as knows what X is. These then support inference to the intended interpretation, namely Jack knows there is a risk and knows what it is. So the first important upshot for natural language reengineering is that we need to change not so much the content of the conceptual information as its deployment. So let me unpack that a bit. In order to bring comprehension and verbal reasoning processes in line with normative explanations of new senses, we don't necessarily need to associate a new stereotype representing conceptual information with the word. We also don't necessarily need to change the component features of the stereotype associated with it or their weights. Rather, it may be enough to change the deployment of the stereotype that already is associated with the word. To facilitate the integration strategy, we need to ensure that, together with contextual cues, the word will also activate relevant non-conceptual information. That this background knowledge gets integrated with information from the associated stereotype, and that both happens in all contexts in which we intend to use the word in the new sense. To facilitate the retention suppression strategy, we need to ensure that in response to contextual cues, irrelevant components of the associated stereotype get suppressed in all those contexts. So the upshot is, conceptual engineers need to think not only about content, but about deployment of concepts. And deployment may be the more relevant factor. This raises a question of mastery. To what extent are we masters of how conceptual information is deployed? This mastery is limited by word processing biases. We'll now consider the question for the retention suppression strategy, where it becomes this. To what extent do people manage to suppress irrelevant stereotype components when encountering a polysemous word in a subordinate sense? To what extent do they thus manage to abide by the explanation of the sense in their judgment and reasoning? This question has been addressed by experiments examining a word processing bias that affects the interpretation of polysemous words, namely the linguistic salience bias. The linguistic salience bias arises when two conditions conspire against suppression in execution of the retention suppression strategy. When one sense of an irregular polyseme is much more frequent and prototypical, that is much more linguistic salient than all other senses, and when some but not all of the features that are strongly associated with that dominant sense are contextually relevant, then contextually irrelevant stereotypical inferences that are supported by the dominant sense will be triggered by the subordinate use as well. And these automatic inferences will influence further judgment and reasoning. This bias is relevant for natural language reengineering. Natural language reengineering introduces new senses that will typically be subordinate to a dominant use that is well established in ordinary discourse. We have examined this bias for 4 instances that are relevant to such conceptual engineering. We've been examining inferences from phenomenal uses of appearance verbs, where the phenomenal sense cancels ordinary implications about what the patient believes, ordinary doxastic implications. We looked at factive implications from phenomenal uses of perception verbs, where the phenomenal sense cancels these factive implications. We've been looking at what you might call the non-medical sense of the affix phobic in words like homophobic or xenophobic, where the implication of mental disorder is cancelled. We had a look at inferences from the philosophical sense of zombie, which cancels the implication of human eating behavior. And we had a look at inferences from the purely epistemic sense of see, illustrated by I see your point, that cancels all the ordinary spatial implications from the verb, namely that the thing I see is in front of me, near me, etc. So in all these cases, we had a look at whether people would go along, would make and go along with the cancelled automatic inferences, the cancelled default inferences from the word. Automatic comprehension inferences are not accessible to introspection. Psycholinguists typically examine them with the cancellation paradigm. In this paradigm, participants read or hear sentences where the expression that is hypothesized to trigger a certain inference is followed by text that is inconsistent with the conclusion of the inference, or as psycholinguists say, with text that cancels this inference. So, for example, to test whether people automatically infer from homophobic that the agent is mentally ill, we'd ask participants to read or listen to sentences like, Joe is homophobic, he is mentally healthy. So, to test whether these inference, whether homophobic in this case actually triggers the inference, we are then looking for certain signature responses that are indicative of cognitive effort. The reasoning is as follows. If people actually make the inference, say from homophobic to is mentally ill, then in items like this one, which end on he is mentally healthy, there will be a clash between the conclusion of the inference and the continued text. This kind of clash with the sequel causes comprehension difficulties. And these require cognitive effort to resolve. When we expend cognitive efforts, our pupils dilate. We need longer to read the cancellation phrase, and our eyes move backwards to previous text in reading. So all these are indications that the verb triggers, or the word triggers, an automatic inference. But this kind of inference can be swiftly suppressed within 1 second, in which case it no longer influences further judgment and reasoning, and is really quite uninteresting to anybody but a dedicated psycholinguist. Therefore, we added an unspeeded plausibility rating task in order to test whether this inference actually does go on to influence people's further judgment. So I'll now present an example that illustrates how this experimental paradigm can be used to address the question of mastery, how we can use it to assess how far competent speakers manage to comply with the definition or explanation of subordinate senses that are affected by linguistic salience bias. Let's have a look at the purely epistemic sense of see, which is variously explained by dictionaries as meaning to be aware of, or know, to understand, or to discern or deduce after reflection or from information. Abstract objects like risks or problems invite this reading for items like 1, Joe sees the problems facing him, or 2, Jack sees the problems that lie behind him. We examine whether these epistemic uses of C trigger spatial inferences, and if so, whether these inferences influence further judgment in violation of the relevant dictionary explanations. Cashing out the familiar spatial time metaphors used here, 1 and 2 mean the same as 1 star. Joe knows what problems he will have in the future. Or 2 star, Jack knows what problems he had in the past. In one of our pre-studies, participants rated future-oriented sentences like 1 star less plausible than past-oriented sentences like 2 star, and rated past-oriented sentences plausible with a mean rating of 4 on a 5-point Likert scale. We can use this mean rating as a norm of correctness to assess whether any spatial inferences automatically triggered by epistemic uses of C go on to influence further judgments. Namely, we can check whether the plausibility ratings for these sentences will remain below those of the paraphrases like 2 star that make explicit their intended purely epistemic interpretation. Another thing we can do is we can compare responses to C sentences with responses to otherwise identical items that use the verb is aware of instead. After all, on the intended interpretation, both of these sentences mean exactly the same. Therefore, the comparison allows us to find out to what extent people are able to interpret C items as intended. Well, let's move over this rather quickly. This slide presents findings from a pupillometry study that examined the hypothesis that also epistemic uses of C trigger spatial inferences. Pupils dilate in the second after sentence offset, where a spatial inference from the first part of the sentence is inconsistent with the second part. The hypothesis predicts that pupil dilations will be observed for items like 2 above, labeled here epistemic inconsistent on the far right-hand side of the slide. A value of 1 on the y-axis here indicates that the pupil size remains exactly the same. In the panel on the left, you see that pupil size increased after people heard inconsistent sentences with C and aware of with visual objects, like Matt sees a spot on the wall behind him. Crucially, in the panel on the right, you see a similar increase for C sentences, but not aware sentences, with abstract objects, like Jack sees the problems that lie behind him. And these increases were significant. This is evidence that also epistemic uses of C trigger automatic spatial inferences. To assess the hypothesis that spatial inferences from all uses of C influence further judgments, we consider plausibility ratings. The hypothesis predicts that inconsistent C items with both visual and epistemic objects will be deemed less plausible than counterparts with aware of. The right-hand panel gives you the mean ratings for items with epistemic objects. You see here that for these items, the spatial manipulation of facing him versus lie behind him did not affect the plausibility ratings for aware sentences, which you see here in the light gray column. Right? They changed just the same. They were just the same in a consistent and inconsistent condition. You'll further observe that they approximate the normatively correct value of 4. By contrast, you observe that the manipulation did make a significant difference for C sentences. So that as a result, we get significantly lower ratings for C sentences like Jack sees the problems that lie behind him, than aware counterparts, like Jack is aware of the problems that lie behind him, which on the intended interpretation mean exactly the same. Indeed, we observe that their mean rating, the mean rating of the C items here, is not significantly different from the neutral midpoint 3, and thereby is also categorically different from the normatively correct rating of 4, which means distinctly plausible. This is evidence that participants did not manage to completely suppress initially triggered spatial inferences, and therefore do not manage to win through to a purely metaphorical interpretation of C items with abstract objects that would be consistent with the dictionary explanation of the epistemic sense of the verb. Now, one would expect that analytic philosophers are particularly well trained in distinguishing, explaining, and reasoning with different senses of words. So one might wonder whether at least these experts, whether at least we guys, manage to interpret epistemic uses of C in line with the dictionary explanations of the epistemic sense. Well, we addressed this question in a study with academic philosophers this summer. You find here the mean ratings for sentences like Jack sees the problems that lie behind him and Jack is aware of the problems that lie behind him from 3 different groups, from psychology undergraduates, from academic philosophers that do not engage with the philosophy of perception, and from experts in the philosophy of perception. Now, you observe that we get exactly the same pattern of responses from all 3 groups. None of them rate C sentences plausible or above 3. All of them find them significantly less plausible than aware sentences that mean the same on the intended interpretation. And indeed, particularly interesting, look at the effect sizes for this C-aware comparison in the lower left-hand corner. You see that the effect size is almost twice as large for philosophers as for psychology undergraduates. That is, if anything, philosophers are even more susceptible to the linguistic salience bias. And philosophers are definitely at least equally unable to abide by the explanations of the epistemic use of C. So this brings us to the conclusion that I would love to present to you if only my presentation allowed me to advance to the next slide. Well, and since it doesn't seem minded to do that, I may just have to talk to you about this. What these findings show is that conceptual engineers cannot simply take for granted that competent speakers will be able to abide by the new definitions or explanations they provide when using the new senses that we're trying to legislate into existence. Or to put it in Humpty Dumpty's terms, we cannot take for granted that we will be masters of the new senses we create. Fortunately, however, the findings also provide some helpful rules of thumb for natural language reengineering. These rules guide the choice of words that is to be given a new sense to convey certain information. And I think I should quickly try to get into this slide again, because this is otherwise a complete waste of time and nuisance. I would like you to be able to see in front of you the relevant rules here. The key recommendation that I would like you to bear in mind if you're trying to actually change the way people use certain words and to actually introduce new sentences of established words is that there is a basic asymmetry between the 2 interpretation strategies that we've discussed for polysemous words. There is a fundamental asymmetry between the integration strategy and the retention suppression strategy. Namely, what we've seen is that the integration strategy requires people to swiftly integrate conceptual information with non-conceptual information. And we've seen that people are generally very good at doing this rapidly. Remember the example of the mechanic checked. By contrast, the retention suppression strategy requires us to suppress contextually irrelevant components of the dominant stereotype. And this suppression is affected by word processing biases, including the linguistic salience bias. We're bad at this. Even analytic philosophers don't manage it. Therefore, first recommendation, wherever possible, introduce senses that can be interpreted with the integration strategy rather than the retention suppression strategy. An example would be Haslanger's definition of woman as systemically oppressed female adult. Second, where there simply is no linguistic item in our stock of words that underspecifies the intended information at a helpful level, we do have to fall back on expressions that overspecify the relevant information, and where we will have to engage in suppression. In this case, what we need to do is we need to circumvent the two conditions that jointly conspire to prevent suppression. That is, rule 2, we need to avoid words which have a pronounced salience imbalance, and we should try to, where we cannot avoid using a word with a pronounced salience imbalance, we should at least ensure that the relevant stereotypical implications are not dependent upon or typically co-instantiated with irrelevant stereotypical implications. Implementing these rules requires doing some psycholinguistic norming work, including corpus analyses and distributional semantic analyses. In case you're interested, this work is described in 2 papers from 2020 in Inquiry and Mind and Language. What I've discussed here is one particular gap in conceptual control created by one particular word processing bias, the linguistic salience bias. To add on a speculative note, it stands to reason that different word processing biases will introduce further gaps in our conceptual control, will further puncture at different points our mastery of new senses we create. Therefore, you do need to engage in some meaningful psycholinguistic investigation in order to navigate these various gaps in our mastery of polysemous words if we are trying to use conceptual engineering to give new senses of words that we can actually use properly in judgment and reasoning. Thank you very much.